Hi, folks. I'm John Kraska, Executive Director for Every Library and the Every Library Institute. Thank you for being part of this conversation today. I'm very excited to be able to talk to Wayne Wiegand, one of the nation's leading scholars of library history, and he's a distinguished author as well. Wayne has written a very important book. I'm very happy to hold it up. It is called In Silence or Indifference. It is a discussion of civil rights, Jim Crow South, and public school libraries. Um, One of the key elements that we've been exploring here at Every Library and the Every Library Institute is the role of erasure, the role of discrimination in censorship. And the fact of the matter is, many of the book ban fights that we've been engaged in are not about the First Amendment, and in a certain respect, they're about the 14th Amendment. They're about the civil rights, the human rights. And the big fight in America today that is, in a lot of ways, an echo of the fight that was happening, or maybe even it's a revisiting, it's a pendulum swing of the fight that was happening 70 years ago with Brown versus Board of Education. We wanted to have this conversation right on the heels of Banned Books Week 2024. If you're watching this as an archive, today's October 2nd, 2024. Banned Books Week is just in our rearview mirror. And we spent a lot of time talking about those big issues on Every Library Live. We wanted to have this conversation around the history of segregation, the history of librarians, whether it's in schools or in public libraries, sometimes the complicity in that segregation, and also a good truth telling. Otherwise, I don't think that we can be honest about where we are and where we want to go as a country and as a profession. So I'm very happy today to welcome Wayne, and I want to do the official biography, Wayne, as you come on camera, if that's okay. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. So Wayne is the F. William Summers Professor of Library and Information Studies Emeritus at Florida State University. With over 4 decades of research, Wayne has written extensively on the history and social significance of libraries, with key works such as Part of Our Lives, A People's History of the American Public Library, and The Desegregation of Public Libraries in the Jim Crow South, Civil Rights and Local Activism. He's often called the Dean of American Library Historians. Wayne's work is essential reading for understanding the crucial role libraries have played in American society. In your latest book, In Silence or Indifference, Racism and Jim Crow Segregated Public School Libraries, you explore the intersection of race, segregation, and access to information, the history of segregated public school libraries in Jim Crow America. Wayne, librarians believe that they are at the forefront of defending intellectual freedom, particularly around diverse books, around race, and around systemic racism. However, you've been part of your professional biography. This book and previous books I mean, it's really easy to ignore our history, unfortunately.
And we have. Let me just make one correction, John. My last name is pronounced Wiegand, not Wigand. I had a
Doing
colleague
that
in
to you.
Wisconsin-Madison whose name was Weingand, and people thought we were married. So our spouses thought that was cute. So it's Wiegand.
I
But go ahead.
apologize and thank
Yeah.
you.
I have been doing this for a half a century. Was working on a PhD in the early 1970s and realized that there probably wouldn't be a job in history PhDs at the end of my journey there. So I picked up a library science degree at the same time. And going through the library science curriculum, I realized that there was almost nothing on the history of libraries, and libraries are ubiquitous. I told my students for decades there are more public libraries in this country than there are McDonald's restaurants, and so they simply weren't receiving any historical attention. And so that's why I got into it. And it's been a wonderfully rich life doing research and writing in it ever since. But I'm coming through that PhD uh, in history. I've also developed a set of critical thinking skills that I apply to that research. And among them is, if you're going to paint an historical portrait as accurately as you can, you have to paint not only the halos, you also have to paint the warts.
Mhm.
And it's the warts that tend to make people uncomfortable as they read through critical evaluative history. And In Silence or Indifference focuses on a very large wart that has been ignored for a half a century.
Well, the idea that Brown versus Board of Education solved all of America's problems, that historically, I was born in 1970. The stories that you're going through here, from Brown in 1954 through 1974, in the golden age, as you describe it, as it's described, of school librarianship here, is lived history. This is not ancient. This is my parents. This is my grandparents. In fact, it's my kids' grandparents as well. But we don't talk about this inside librarianship. I'm not a librarian by trade. I haven't gone through, gotten an MLS. I have a tremendous amount of respect for anybody who has the degree. And yet we talk about race right now as if we've never been complicit. We've never been participatory in the systems of white supremacy as institutions, whether it's public library or education.
Yeah. Um, There is a literature that explores issues of race in American library history, but generally it's tended to have been ignored. In addition, so many ALA accredited schools of library and information science have dropped history courses from the curriculum. So people coming into the profession through the educational programs are not acquainted with their own history as they gain entry into the profession. So there's a whole bunch of obstacles placed in the way of individuals who might be find an interest in their own history that are hard to overcome. I was I can go through how In Silence or Indifference has been published by the University Press of Mississippi. And as the editors of the University Press of Mississippi read through the contents, certain things came to their mind having to do with the naming of the series headings that they publish. And in the advertisement for In Silence or Indifference, for example, you will not see the words library science or information science, library studies or information studies included in that. So their way of thinking, librarianship is sort of coincidental to the subject I'm talking about. However, when that manuscript hit the table of the catalogers at the Library of Congress for its cataloging and publication information, the catalogers, having been skilled in library science through ALA accredited programs, immediately thought librarianship is where we put this. And so it got a Z and it got an 027 number, which automatically, once those numbers are associated with any book, it determines in large part who sees uh, the book as an existing product. So it's sort of caught between two worlds. And you can see this reflected in librarianship itself. As I mentioned to you before, I think I've published 9 books in the 21st century on American library history. And none of them has been noticed in American libraries, which is the major organ of the American Library Association. Now, I'm not complaining about that, but I'm saying American libraries, librarians, library columnists look to particular publishers for new titles. They don't look to university publishers where I've published all of those books in the 21st century.
I think it's fascinating. I'm reading from your epilogue. It's always a great way to start an interview, by the way, is to read from the epilogue. You say, as a library historian, I contend it is impossible for members of the nation's library community to fathom the full burden of responsibility if such huge chunks of our past, like the history recounted here, remain unknown to the present. I mean, the relative invisibility of Black school librarians in American library history is a direct manifestation of how white librarianship treated the issue of segregated school libraries between 1954 and 1974 with silence or indifference. I was appalled while I was reading this at several points, both as a citizen of America in the 21st century, as a white man myself, and as somebody who believes very firmly in the equity and the equanimity of library services to see these histories. Have we been sweeping it under the rug, Wayne, or have we just decided that we're going to start fresh in 1974?
I would say there's something subconscious. I don't think there was a conscious effort to bury this. If you checked the end notes at the end of the book, you will notice that there are hardly any citations as evidentiary citations to library literature. And that's because the library profession, for the most part, and its associations in particular, chose to ignore the issue because it was divisive.
Hmm.
Because, I mean, you had Southern librarians who were members of the American Library Association. Now, I'll use the American Library Association as sort of a focus for this. And the American Library Association did not want to alienate those Southern librarians. Those Southern librarians knew very well that there was a um, uh, limited amount of space for them to discuss the issue of segregation and integration without threats to their own professional standing.
Hmm.
So the subject was simply not discussed. I found one article written in 1971, a three-page article by Pat Schumann in School Library Journal that even addressed the issue. So it's invisible to the profession at the time it was occurring. Of course, it's going to be invisible to the profession in subsequent decades because there's not a record of its existence. Almost all of what I found came out of, I'll give you some examples, um, 47 master's theses written at the historically Black college and university, Atlanta University, under the direction of Black School of Library Service Dean Virginia Lacey Jones.
Hmm.
Those theses, of course, did not see publication. They were cited in the major index of librarianship. They didn't see publication, and I accessed them because they'd not all been digitized. I got a great deal of information about Black school libraries in the 50s and the 60s from those theses.
Hmm.
I haven't seen those theses cited in other American library history works. That's one body of work. The National Education Association did so much more with the subject of desegregation and segregated schools, so much more that I found a great deal of information in its records, and they would often mention school libraries as a tangent of what was happening with segregation and desegregation. So I got a lot of information there. Then, because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was tied directly to subsequent funding programs coming out of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty programs, and in particular the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, because any public school obtaining funds from the ESEA had to comply with rules and regulations coming out of the Voting Rights Act of the previous year. There were a lot of reports that had to be made from local places to Washington, D.C. And in the National Archives, I found just a whole host of evidence of what was going on. So it'd be easy for someone doing a PhD in American library history at an accredited school right now to go back into the library literature and see nothing.
Hmm.
However, going through other relevant literatures, that's where the story emerged, and that's why this is one that has never been told before, but for Pat Schumann's little three-page article in School Library Journal.
Well, I'm been reading In Silence or Indifference, folks, and Pat Schumann's editorial here is dog-eared on. It was not until the spring of 1971 that someone in the nation's library press finally commented on the racist practice of declaring faculties integrated by transferring black school librarians and black teachers with no library training into integrated white school libraries. The 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 gosh, I mean, like I don't. There was a group of black school librarians in segregated schools. There's a group of black principals. There's administrators, And when desegregation came around as the law of the land, the state departments of education, particularly in the South, moving qualified black librarians into white schools underneath people, white supervisors who have no credentials. I mean, the systems that wanted to keep black and white students apart, who wanted to keep black history hidden. I mean, you've unearthed in the scholarships that you did some extraordinary stories of overlooked black librarianship and the students that they served.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the reason that occurred, of course, white principals and white superintendents wanted to resist integration as much as they could. But they were also tempted by that federal money that came to them through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Now,
Mhm.
that act, within 5 years, that act almost doubled the number of school libraries nationwide, and
Mhm.
it quadrupled the average collection size. So the nation's school library community was very happy, and that's why they often refer to this period as the golden age of school librarianship.
Mhm.
Well, of course, those principals and those superintendents still wanted access to that money, but then there was the Voting Rights Act of the um, previous year that they had to comply with. And so, as a mechanism to resist while at the same time qualifying for money, they began taking black school librarians out of black schools and putting them into white schools.
Mhm.
That allowed them to say they had an integrated faculty, and that's allowed them then to get the federal funds. But imagine the black school librarian going into that white school library.
Mhm.
For the most part, she and almost all of them were female, were chilled by the white school faculty. And in many cases, for example, the black school librarian was forbidden from using the white faculty lounge and bathrooms. They had to go into the student bathrooms. And of course, they got all sorts of humiliating comments, et cetera, from the white students. A reason that those principals and school superintendents like this was because it also limited the amount of contact white students had with black educators.
The amount of collection money that flowed because of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act at that time in that time period. I mean, the numbers are staggering. The idea that most of the material, though, that was available to purchase did not tell the story of any other population than white population. And that is also one of the persistent legacies in librarianship right now in 2024. For most of my professional involvement with librarianship has been trying to diversify the collection, to make sure that it is inclusive, to make sure that it's reflective of the populations that are being served, but also open new pathways to understanding and empathy at the same time. I can't even imagine what it would have been like to have to go through one of those indices, purchase all the books that are on that thing, and not having any of your own stories told as a black librarian.
Yeah, the black school librarians in the Jim Crow South before 1974 had to, there were all sorts of obstacles placed in their way uh, to acquire materials that showed life through African American experiences. Um, Let me give you some ideas. By 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, the world of librarianship had developed a system of guides that supposedly identified the best literature from which the average school library ought to collect. One of these was Senior High School Library Catalog, for example. It was published by the H.W. Wilson Company, which also published, old people listening to me now will recognize this, Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature.
I know that
Uh,
one. Yeah.
Right. Well, and it also published library literature, which was the main index for the practice of librarianship. Well, the books that senior high school library catalog listed had to be published in, had to be reviewed in uh, periodicals that Reader's Guide to Public to Periodical Literature indexed. So you already had a mechanism set up for
Mhm.
filtering the kind of materials that found their way into citations in these acquisition catalogs. And Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature did not index a Black periodical until 1956.
Hmm.
So the school librarian, the Black school librarian, let's say in Columbus, Georgia, would uh, have to independently acquire the materials like Crisis magazine, which was published since 1911, I think, by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which had a circulation of 100,000 per year, which
Mhm.
greatly outnumbered many of the periodicals that Reader's Guide was indexing. So you have to ask yourself, was that deliberate? Because if they pasted on numbers alone, it would have been indexed from its origins. And in addition to that, those acquisitions guides that I mentioned, like Senior High School Library Catalog, they became the recommended acquisitions guide by state departments of education, which would often say, okay, if you select materials from these acquisitions guides, we will match funds.
Hmm.
Okay, if your book budget is $1,000, we'll give you another $1,000, but only if you acquire books from these acquisitions guides, which meant again to the Black school librarian, no matching funds for W.E.B. Du Bois's Soul of Black Folks
Yeah.
or Chicago Defender, which was the major newspaper for African American culture in the 20th century. So all of those obstacles were in their way in order to acquire materials um, uh, that African American children could access. But there is even one more. Um, Most libraries in the 20th century worked through what were called jobbers. Baker and Taylor, for example, is one. And those jobbers would, of course, acquire massive amounts of titles of popular authors and then offer substantial discounts to the libraries. And they would only have to pay one bill for a number of titles. Well, the Black publishers never got access to the Baker Taylor kinds of jobbers. So those titles could never be purchased at discount for the Black school librarian. Again, systemic reasons for the difficulties Black school librarians had to go through just to get materials that was that looked at life through African American eyes.
I was reading the book, and at times, growing up in a fairly, Democrat, Chicago, West suburbs, kind of place like I did, we were not an integrated community in Berwyn, Illinois, my hometown when I was a kid. We are now. The block I live on, the town I live in. I stayed here in order to try and do the best I could as a citizen and as a community involved, community leader type person. And yet, Wayne, I got to be honest with you, I hit the middle of the book. I hit the middle of the book, chapter 6, and I sat upright, bolt upright in bed. It said by 1968, all Southern State Library and State School Library Associations had been desegregated. By 1968, Wayne, I mean,
Mhm.
like the fact that this was the law of the land or the habit, culture, and tradition, okay, of these folks, like the fact that it was 1968 before these professional organizations finally, and at that point, it wasn't like we had a parade. I'm sure it wasn't joyful. A lot of it was being dragged across the threshold of desegregation. But to say from 1954 with Brown to 1968 before the last one was officially desegregated is it's not an explanation, but it sure does shed light on why these parts of our history are so deeply hidden. Nobody wanted it to change in certain places.
Yeah, as I say in the book, the last paragraph, the American Association of School Librarians, uh, it will celebrate its 75th anniversary in 2025. The American Library Association, as well as Library Journal, will celebrate its 150th anniversary in 2026. If if library professionals do not reflect seriously on their history, what those celebrations are going to be are happy history nostalgic events, and one will not learn from them. ALA recently came out when the critical race theory was a hot topic in 220, and you're having a lot of politicians saying woke this, woke that. American Library Association Executive Board came out with a statement in, I think, August of 2021, saying that for 140 years, the American Library Association has defended librarians and access to freedom. And that smacked me right in the face because I was putting the finishing touches to this book, which gives evidence to the fact that not so. Maybe for some people, but not for all people, as this book shows. Now, it's not that they did that deliberately, not that the executive board did that deliberately. The executive board did that because it lives in a historical, an information silo that tends not to look at its history. And so it makes statements that have historical content that are historically inaccurate. And that's why I'm hoping these celebrations that are forthcoming in future years, people take a serious look at their history so that they learn from it and don't paint just the halos.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about library neutrality across your writing, and you do talk about how you argue that the idea that libraries are neutral is a myth. And that myth of neutrality continues to shape or even limit our current approach to library practices, especially today in a very politically charged environment. I mean, can you unspool this idea of library neutrality or the myth of library neutrality in relation to a history of segregation that's so plain once you open it up and find blank pages?
Yeah, I'll make this statement categorically. Libraries have never been neutral. All you have to do is look for quote unquote the warts. Now, in 2022 or 2023, I can't remember anymore. Stanley Kurtz wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times
Yeah.
titled, I think, Recovering the Soul of the Library or something like that. And in it, he lamented the comments that he called woke librarians were making, and he desired a return to library neutrality. Well, when I read that, of course, I'm thinking, really? Libraries were neutral? You can go to In Silence or Indifference to demonstrate that for African Americans between 1954 and 1974 in public schools across the Jim Crow South, they were not neutral at all.
Hmm.
So the myth of library neutrality in part arises because of a reluctance to engage in conversation about controversial subjects. And that reluctance traces back to the origins of American librarianship. I'll just say, let's say, starting in 1876 when the ALA organized and Library Journal published its first issue, that reluctance to engage in conversation about very delicate subjects, be it race, be it gender, be it sexual orientation, that reluctance created a silence that
Hmm.
that gave rise to the impression that the library was neutral. Yes, sometimes it collected books that purported to promote communism, and sometimes it collected books that purported to promote democracy, but that was political, not
Hmm.
social and
Hmm.
cultural.
Well, it's interesting because this week, I mean, today's October 2nd that we're making this conversation recording happen. Last week, one of the big articles that was making the rounds on social media was Time Magazine talking about how we almost lost World War II. We almost lost the Cold War because we were defunding libraries, and this idea that library services and the librarian mindset and the librarian approach to information was something that helped America prevail. And inside that article was something that I think is underappreciated, and when it comes to that neutrality conversation, a lot of the big movers and shakers in that immediate post-war era of librarianship, and even some folks who went on to do things like setting up the OCLC, group, were part of OSS and the Office for Strategic Services. The idea that there was a neutrality when these are government libraries, and I don't mean to sound like a MAGA wearing hat right now, but they're all, publicly funded institutions. The public university systems and the public funding that went into private universities, the idea that the OSS was a precursor training ground for modern librarianship, I mean, that obviates any conversation about neutrality.
I can't possibly disagree with you.
Yeah, I know it's a little off topic on this particular title, but it's part of a whole cloth. I mean, when you're looking at the 50s and the idea that mis and disinformation is sometimes coming from inside the house.
But I don't want to seem like I'm taking a tangent on you, John, but um, what the librarians who worked that turf in the late 1940s, early 1950s had a particular perception of what a library should be. One of the first sentences out of my mouth in American library history courses I've taught has been, there is no holy book in which God tells us what a library should be. People make libraries. Now, as I see libraries in the United States evolving in the last 2, 3 centuries, there are three components that go into it. First comes out of the French Enlightenment, which celebrated what was called useful knowledge, the kind of knowledge that could be harnessed for economic purposes, social purposes, useful knowledge. That word has a direct connection to how we use the word information now and how those OSS guys used it in the late 40s, early 50s.
Hmm.
There's also an element associated with libraries that has to do with reading, and I'll call it the social nature of reading. We really don't fully comprehend how people connect through their reading. We're doing a lot of research these days to do it. Historically, there's a real good body of literature that's arisen in the last 40 years on the social nature, historically social nature of reading. But the third thing is the library is physical space, and we've not done very well historically with understanding that. When Andrew Carnegie gave those millions of dollars for 1,500 public libraries, the communities that applied for grants didn't know how to build, many of those didn't know how to build libraries. So they asked the Carnegie people, what should we do? The Carnegie people came up with 6 blueprints for libraries, depending on the size of the community. Biggest ones for the big community, smallest for the smallest. Every one of those 6 blueprints had included in it a community room.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
those community rooms across the nation were used for a variety of purposes. Sewing classes in rural Minnesota, language classes in the New York Public Library, citizenship classes in the San Francisco Public Library. Over time, librarians did really well with their acquisition practices, and the collections they amassed tended to get put into the community rooms, and so they sort of disappeared from the memory of librarians. The fact that now we like the idea of libraries as a community place,
Hmm.
but most people think that's a relatively recent idea. It is not. If you
Right.
look, you were in Louisville a couple of weeks ago.
Hmm.
Okay, the when Louisville opened its 2 quote unquote colored branches in segregated parts of segregated Louisville, the person who was in charge was Thomas Fountain Blue, and he crystallized the concept of library as community center in large part because the people who he was serving had limited access to the public spaces that Louisville made available to them. And
Hmm.
so you see, except for the information technology we have in 2024, you see precedent for almost everything that happens in public library spaces today in those two libraries in the early part of the 20th century. Again, the history has been lost to us. So we think it's a new idea.
That's really fascinating. I've been to the original, one of the original Carnegie libraries in Carnegie, Pennsylvania, where there's a gymnasium and there's a performance art space as well. And
Right.
I mean, Wayne, it's like we never like we forget. Every so
Yeah.
often, the library industry just forgets, and we figure out we decide that we made it up again.
And again, I'll come back to the relative ahistorical nature of our profession.
So, can we talk a little bit about your earlier book, The Desegregation of Public Libraries in the Jim Crow South?
Sure.
The school systems that were being dragged across the desegregation lines by Brown and Brown 2 and several other Supreme Court decisions, the reluctance and the resistance on the part of folks in Jim Crow America, not just the South, to having schools desegregated, public libraries at the same time, in the same American moment, were um, operationalizing plenty of Jim Crow policies. They were operationalizing systemic racism, and yet the ideals that we reflect on, the ideals that we keep coming back to as a profession of community centeredness, of being responsive to the community's needs, to collecting in a way that reflects the community. I mean, how do we reconcile the fact that the first sit down, the first sit-in in a public library in America was in 1939 in Alexandria, Virginia, and everybody, fast forwards to 1963.
Yeah. And it occurred 3 months after the American Library Association passed its first version of the Library Bill of Rights.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Tell me more.
3 months. Um, Alexandria, Virginia, and Brenda Mitchell Powell just came out with a book on uh, the five black teenagers who sat in the Alexandria, Virginia.
And
Uh,
And if I can shout out to Rose Dawson, the library director there, who's been doing a tremendous amount to surface that history for the community of Alexandria. But please tell me about the book.
Yeah. Okay. So the American Library Association held its 1936 convention in Richmond, Virginia. And what happened was the black librarians who were ALA members who attended could not book hotels in the same hotels. They couldn't eat meals in the same room as white ALA members. And this got into the national media and began a conversation.
Hmm.
Now, in addition to that, this was about the time you're starting to see Nazi Germany burn a lot of Jewish books or leftward leaning books,
Hmm.
and Japan had invaded China and was doing much the same with Chinese materials.
Hmm.
So the library profession developed a kind of a concept, maybe we should develop a set of principles that articulates our defense of intellectual freedom and opposition to censorship, but it did it with blinders, so obvious blinders that when they passed the Library Bill of Rights, 3 months later, those five black teenagers went into the Alexandria Public Library. There was such a reluctance to discuss the issue in the library press that they really ignored it. It made plenty of news in Washington, D.C. newspapers, New
Hmm.
York papers, other papers across the nation, but not in the library press. The director of the Office of Intellectual Freedom in 1968, not knowing that sit-in existed, could say, since 1939, we've been defenders of intellectual freedom, opponents of, and etc., because she did not know that history existed.
Hmm. That is a painful thing. I mean, part of the constructs around intellectual freedom that we are in the middle of defending right now with the current crisis around book bans and censorship is one of viewpoint. We've already discussed tonight the idea that neutrality is not possible, in a library, and it's a fallacy to even begin to talk about neutrality. But the idea that viewpoint is so integral to the First Amendment, but in terms of the dignity of every reader and the relevance of books to different minority populations, whether it's religious or racial or gender and sexuality, the like we're defending in an intellectual freedom construct. Um, I mean, it's Enlightenment era rather than progressive era. It's not even progressive era. It's civil rights era. Like we're defending the intellectual freedom on the basis of Congress shall make no law abridging, But it's not truly, in my experience, rooted in the humanity of that community center in segregated Louisville that should be amplified today.
Mhm. Um, a couple of years ago, two research educators surveyed a sample of the nation's educational community on their racial attitudes. And what they found was teachers in grade schools and high schools, their racial attitudes fairly well reflected the racial attitudes of the rest of the American population.
Hmm.
I have a question. Why hasn't anybody done this in librarianship?
That's a very interesting question, Wayne, and I would like to get a grant from somebody and do that work. That would be very interesting.
Right. That
Yeah.
I think the findings of that kind of survey research
Hmm.
would invite us to have a discussion we're currently not having.
Hmm. So one of the things that we know from the research that we've done here at every library is that we've cracked open the national voter file. The national voter file is terrifying. It's all of your it's not who you voted for, of course, but it's whether you took a ballot or not. Did you return a ballot? In states where there's a partisan primary, did you vote in the partisan primary? And then it attaches all of your consumer behaviors to your voter file, because that's how they market to you for candidates. That's how they make you crazy about the other guy. And the voter file for librarians, if you take a look at people who have the word library or librarian attached to their records, somewhere in the neighborhood of 87% of them in states where there's a partisan primary, they're pulling a Democrat ballot. Okay. And if you look at Bloomberg News's review of presidential politics in the 2020 election, the Biden-Trump election, 9 out of 10 librarians who donated to a presidential candidate donated to Biden, and that's higher as a ratio than cops donated to Trump. Now,
Mhm.
it's fascinating to me how progressive our language is in this industry. And I have to think it's perhaps slightly more rarefied because there's a lot fewer librarians than there are educators. And I don't mean just school librarians. I mean, just numerically, there's,
Mhm.
150, 160,000 librarians, maybe 260 or so all told.
Mhm.
Um, and there's a lot more educators. So maybe we are a little, Wayne, that's a hell of a question.
Go for it.
Okay, that sounds great. We have
Yeah,
our next project.
I'm not equipped to
Yeah,
conduct that kind of research,
yeah.
but it occurred to me how to introduce these controversial subjects into the profession's discourse. That might be one way to do it.
Hmm.
I have been a consistent advocate for the establishment of a commission on racism in our profession. Most other professions have done this
Yeah.
and come up with some discoveries,
In
but
here, you talk a lot about how the NEA, the National Education
yeah,
Association, did that reckoning and did
yeah,
that deliberative work. And I think it's a component of the fact that the NEA is, uh, if I remember my NEA history properly, they also did merge at one point with one of the Black Educator Associations as well. So
yeah, it did during
there
this
might be a
time
little,
period. Yeah.
yeah.
If they did it during this time period. But within the NEA, there was a uh, a group mostly of northern white liberals
Uh-huh.
forced the issue. Uh, Coming out of the block, when Brown versus the Board of Education was issued in 1954, the NEA had a tepid response to it. It wasn't until the late 50s and into the 60s when a number of people just took that issue on and forced the whole membership of the NEA to confront it. They did it
Hmm.
with conference programs, they did it with symposia, colloquia, they published a lot of stuff about it, which is absent in librarianship. You don't see any conference colloquia, symposia, conference plans about the issue before 1974.
Hmm. As somebody who, um, again, is I'm not personally a librarian. I don't work in libraries. I'm not qualified to work in libraries. It's not my thing. I run a political action committee in a think tank, a public policy think tank for libraries. Um, for me to hear that we have not done the homework, we haven't done the heavy lifting, um, as a sector makes me troubled, and it is something that I would like to be involved in fixing. Those conversations that we're having tonight, and I appreciate you coming on to talk with us here in the Every Library context. But one of the things that we have to be able to do with honesty is to say that our history continues when it's got a halo, but our history has been confronted when it's got the warts. And I think that we're capable as a sector to do that, especially given the amount of time and attention we're spending on these principles around intellectual freedom, freedom of access, free expression right now. Um, Closing thoughts from you, Wayne. We're well into a good hour here in this conversation. I got two questions for you. The first one is closing thoughts around the resonance of the civil rights conversations in 1954 to 1974 with 2024 around collections, around the practice of librarianship. And then, of course, my last question for you is going to be, what's on your plate next? But let me talk. Let's talk about 54 to 74 and 2024, please.
You want me to draw parallels between the two?
You tell me what you're seeing.
Oh, um, I may struggle with that question. Um, there are certain things that over which librarianship has little control.
Hmm.
Um, uh, if publishers don't publish diverse literatures, librarians have limited opportunities to acquire that stuff for their collections.
Yeah.
Uh, if children's literature does not have a lot of non-white kids built into its narratives, Black kids are not going to see themselves in children's literature. So that's a limitation that's automatically superimposed on the practice of librarianship. Librarianship has also inherited systemic racism. There is still, in the Library of Congress subject headings, for example, um, illegal alien. If they mess around with that at the Library of Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to be coming across the street yelling in the ear of the Librarian of Congress. So there are political limitations under which we operate. Classification systems, they're not neutral. They're crafted by individuals who import their own biases and prejudices, sometimes consciously, sometimes not consciously. And we need to alert ourselves to these systemic uh, biases that we've inherited from systems. We do a pretty good job in 2024, but we weren't doing a very good job in 1954, for example. So history helps to uncover those limitations, but it has to be analyzed with a critical and an evaluative eye, not a celebratory eye. And that's what I fear most is going to be in the next couple of years.
Well, I appreciate that um, it's not looking for a neat parallelism. It's not looking for a bow on it. But what I am looking for is exactly that. The call to action, as it were, to not be hagiographical. and I appreciate that very much. And I hope that the folks who've been listening and watching this will benefit from that same sort of insight. So, Wayne, what are you up to next? You've
Well,
just finished a wonderful book. I hope that the next project is something that I'll be able to take a bite out of too.
I am 78, so I think I'm about to embark on my last book length project. And
Okay.
because I'm here on the West Coast, in the East Bay area, and because the San Francisco Public Library will be celebrating its 150th anniversary, I'm going to write a history of the San Francisco Public Library. One of the reasons I undertook it is the San Francisco Public Librarians and Archivists have preserved a whole lot of material, much of which I can access from my computer right
Yeah.
here in my home. So I'm sure through a good part of the research. But San Francisco is an example of community that early embraced diversity. And I'm chasing how they dealt with that through the ages. I don't think there are many libraries in the country with a unit that is devoted to gay, lesbian, transgender history, or collections. And so I want to make sure I incorporate that into the history of the San Francisco Public Library too. So I'm having a great deal of fun because I got a lot of materials and I got a lot of diversity to play off. And I don't know how I'm going to be able to get it all in a 300-page book. That'll be the challenge.
Well, I think that sounds fascinating. And having been a very happy tourist in that area, it'll be a lot of fun to see what you uncover. So,
Okay.
Wayne Wiegand, thank you so much. I think I got it right, right? The
You did,
yeah,
yeah.
good. In silence or indifference. And I need to make sure that I get it right. The University Press of Mississippi, they were good to work with, it sounds like.
They were, yes. Enjoyed my work with them very much.
hmm So, in silence or indifference, folks, it's available right now. Also, please take a look at Wayne's earlier books, "The Desegregation of Public Libraries in the Jim Crow South," as well as one of my favorites. We didn't even get to it. I apologize. "Part of Our Lives: A People's History of the American Public Library." Wayne, thank you so much for tonight.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Very good.